Hello, welcome back to the People's Historian. Thank you for joining me. I'm Jason Kishinev. We're starting Chapter 18 in A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, an author who inspires me because he has told history from the position from the perspective of people and of movements rather than of states and rulers. So Chapter 18, if you enjoy the reading, remember hit that like and subscribe button and the notification bell because YouTube will unsubscribe viewers. Chapter 18, The Impossible Victory, Vietnam. From 1964 to 1972, the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the history of the world made a maximum military effort with everything short of atomic bombs to defeat a nationalist revolutionary movement in a tiny peasant country and failed. When the United States fought in Vietnam, it was organized modern technology versus organized human beings, and the human beings won. In the course of that war, there developed in the United States the greatest anti-war movement the nation had ever experienced. A movement that played a critical part in bringing the war to an end. It was another startling fact of the 60s. In the fall of 1945, Japan, defeated, was forced to leave Indochina, the former French colony it had occupied at the start of the war. In the meantime, a revolutionary movement had grown there, determined to end colonial control and to achieve a new life for the peasants of Indochina. Led by a communist named Ho Chi Minh, the revolutionists fought against the Japanese, and when they were gone, held a spectacular celebration in Hanoi in late 1945, with 1 million people in the streets, and issued a Declaration of Independence. It borrowed from the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in the French Revolution, and from the American Declaration of Independence, and began, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Just as the Americans in 1976 had listed their grievances against the English king, the Vietnamese listed their complaints against French rule. They have enforced inhuman laws. They have built more prisons than schools. They have mercilessly slain our patriots. They have drowned uprisings in rivers of blood. They have fettered public opinion. They have robbed us of our rice fields, our mines, our forests, and our raw materials. They have invented numerous unjustifiable taxes and reduced our people, especially our peasantry, to a state of extreme poverty. From the end of last year to the beginning of this year, more than 2 million of our fellow citizens died of starvation. The whole Vietnamese people, animated by a common purpose, are determined to fight to the bitter end against any attempt by the French colonialists to reconquer their country. The U.S. Defense Department's study of the Vietnam War, intended to be top secret but released to the public by Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo in the famous Pentagon Papers case, described Ho Chi Minh's work. Ho had built the Viet Minh into the only Vietnam-wide political organization capable of effective resistance to either the Japanese or the French. He was the only Vietnamese wartime leader with a national following, and he assured himself wider fealty among the Vietnamese people when in August through September 1945 he overthrew the Japanese, established the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and staged receptions for incoming Allied occupation forces. For a few weeks in September 1945, Vietnam was, for the first and only time in its modern history, free of foreign domination and united from north to south under Ho Chi Minh. The Western powers were already at work to change this. England occupied the southern part of Indochina and then turned it back to the French. Nationalist China, this was under Chiang Kai-shek before the Communist Revolution, occupied the northern part of Indochina, and the United States persuaded it to turn that back to the French. As Ho Chi Minh told an American journalist, "We apparently stand quite alone. We shall have to depend on ourselves." Between October 1945 and February 1946, Ho Chi Minh wrote 8 letters to President Truman reminding him of the self-determination promises of the Atlantic Charter. One of the 3 letters was sent both to Truman and to the United Nations. "I wish to invite attention of Your Excellency for strictly humanitarian reasons to following matter. 2 million Vietnamese died of starvation during winter of 1944 and spring 1945 because of starvation policy of French, who seized and stored until it rotted all available rice. 3/4 of cultivated land was flooded in summer 1945, which was followed by a severe drought. Of normal harvest, 5/6 was lost. Many people are starving. Unless great world powers and international relief organizations bring us immediate assistance, we face imminent catastrophe." Truman never replied. In October of 1946, the French bombarded Haiphong, a port in northern Vietnam, and there began the 8-year war between the Viet Minh movement and the French over who would rule Vietnam. After the communist victory in China in 1949 and the Korean War the following year, the United States began giving large amounts of military aid to the French. By 1954, the United States had given 300,000 small arms and machine guns, enough to equip the entire French army in Indochina, and $1 billion altogether. The United States was financing 80% of the French war effort. Why was the United States doing this? To the public, the word was that the United States was helping to stop communism in Asia, but there was not much public discussion. In the secret memoranda of the National Security Council, which advised the president on foreign policy, there was talk in 1950 of what came to be known as the domino theory, that like a row of dominoes, if one country fell to communism, the next would do the same, and so on. It was important, therefore, to keep the first one from falling. A secret memo of the National Security Council in June 1952 also pointed to the chain of U.S. military bases along the coast of China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. Communist control of all of Southeast Asia would render the U.S. position in the Pacific offshore island chain precarious and would seriously jeopardize fundamental U.S. security interests in the Far East. And Southeast Asia, especially Malaya and Indonesia, is the principal world source of natural rubber and tin, and a producer of petroleum and other strategically important commodities. It was also noted that Japan depended on the rice of Southeast Asia, and communist victory there would make it extremely difficult to prevent Japan's eventual accommodation to communism. In 1953, a congressional study mission reported, "The area of Indochina is immensely wealthy in rice, rubber, coal, and iron ore. Its position makes it a strategic key to the rest of South Asia." That year, a State Department memorandum said that the French were losing the war in Indochina, had failed to win a sufficient native support, feared that a negotiated settlement would mean the eventual loss to communism not only of Indochina but of the whole of Southeast Asia, and concluded if the French actually decided to withdraw, the U.S. would have to consider most seriously whether to take over in this area. In 1954, the French, having been unable to win Vietnamese popular support, which was overwhelmingly behind Ho Chi Minh and the revolutionary movement, had to withdraw. An international assemblage at Geneva presided over the peace agreement between the French and the Viet Minh. It was agreed that the French would temporarily withdraw into the southern part of Vietnam, that the Viet Minh would remain in the north, and that an election would take place in 2 years in a unified Vietnam to enable the Vietnamese to choose their own government. The United States moved quickly to prevent the unification and to establish South Vietnam as an American sphere. It set up in Saigon as head of the government a former Vietnamese official named Ngo Dinh Diem, who had recently been living in New Jersey. Sorry about my pronunciation. I'm doing my best. Who had recently been living in New Jersey and encouraged him not to hold the scheduled elections for unification. A memo in early 1954 of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said that intelligence estimates showed a settlement based on free elections would be attended by almost certain loss of the associated states, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, the 3 parts of Indochina created by the Geneva Conference, to communist control. Diem again and again blocked the elections requested by the Viet Minh, and with American money and arms, his government became more and more firmly established. As the Pentagon Papers put it, South Vietnam was essentially the creation of the United States. The Diem regime became increasingly unpopular. Diem was a Catholic, and most Vietnamese were Buddhists. Diem was close to the landlords, and this was a country of peasants. His pretenses at land reform left things basically as they were. He replaced locally selected provincial chiefs with his own men appointed in Saigon. By 1962, 88% of these provincial chiefs were military men. Diem imprisoned more and more Vietnamese who criticized the regime for corruption, for lack of reform. Opposition grew quickly in the countryside where Diem's apparatus could not reach well, and around 1958, guerrilla activities began against the regime. The communist regime in Hanoi gave aid, encouragement, and sent people south, most of them Southerners, who had gone north after the Geneva Accords to support the guerrilla movement. In 1960, the National Liberation Front was formed in the South. It united the various strands of opposition to the regime. Its strength came from South Vietnamese peasants who saw it as a way of changing their daily lives. A U.S. government analyst named Douglas Pike, in his book Viet Cong, based on interviews with rebels and captured documents, tried to give a realistic assessment of what the United States faced. In the 2,561 villages of South Vietnam, the National Liberation Front created a host of nationwide socio-political organizations in a country where mass organizations were virtually non-existent. Aside from the NLF, there had never been a truly mass-based political party in South Vietnam. Pike wrote, "The communists have brought to the villages of South Vietnam significant social change and have done so largely by means of the communication process." That is, they were organizers much more than they were warriors. What struck me most forcibly about the NLF was its totality as a social revolution first and as a war second. Pike was impressed with the mass involvement of the peasants in the movement. The rural Vietnamese was not regarded simply as a pawn in a power struggle, but as the active element in the thrust. He was the thrust, Pike wrote. The purpose of this vast organizational effort was to restructure the social order of the village and train the villages to control themselves. This was the NLF's one undeviating thrust from the start. Not the killing of ARVN soldiers, not the occupation of real estate, not the preparation for some great pitched battle, but organization in depth of the rural population through the instrument of self-control. Pike estimated that the NLF membership by early 1962 stood at around 300,000. The Pentagon Papers said of this period, only the Viet Cong had any real support and influence on a broad base in the countryside. When Kennedy took office in early 1961, he continued the policies of Truman and Eisenhower in Southeast Asia. I can say it. Almost immediately, he approved a secret plan for various military actions in Vietnam and Laos, including the dispatch of agents to North Vietnam to engage in sabotage and light harassment, according to the Pentagon Papers. Back in 1956, he had spoken of the amazing success of President Diem and said of Diem's Vietnam, her political liberty is an inspiration. Oh, my Kennedy impression is terrible. One day in June 1963, a Buddhist monk sat down in the public square in Saigon and set himself afire. More Buddhist monks began committing suicide by fire to dramatize their opposition to the Diem regime. Diem's police raided the Buddhist pagodas and temples, wounded 30 monks, arrested 1,400 people, and closed down the pagodas. There were demonstrations in the city. The police fired, killing 9 people. Then, in Hue, the ancient capital, 10,000 demonstrated in protest. Under the Geneva Accords, the United States was permitted to have 685 military advisors in southern Vietnam. Eisenhower secretly sent several thousand. Under Kennedy, the figure rose to 16,000, and some of them began to take part in combat operations. Diem was losing. Most of the South Vietnam countryside was now controlled by local villagers organized by the NLF. Diem was becoming an embarrassment, an obstacle to effective control over Vietnam. Some Vietnamese generals began plotting to overthrow his regime, staying in touch with a CIA man named Lucien Conine. Conine met secretly with American Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge, who was enthusiastically for the coup. Lodge reported to Kennedy's assistant, McGeorge Bundy, on October 25th. I have personally approved each meeting between General Tran Van Dorn and Conine, who has carried out my orders in each instance explicitly. Kennedy seemed hesitant, but no move was made to warn Diem. Indeed, just before the coup and just after, he had been in touch through Conine with the plotters. Lodge spent a weekend with Diem at a seaside resort. When on November 1st, 1963, the generals attacked the presidential palace, Diem phoned Ambassador Lodge, and the conversation went as followed. Diem said, "Some units have made a rebellion, and I want to know what is the attitude of the United States." Henry Cabot Lodge said, "I do not feel well enough informed to be able to tell you. I have heard the shooting, but I'm not acquainted with all of the facts. Also, it is 4:30 a.m. out in Washington, and the U.S. government cannot possibly have a view." Diem says, "But you must have some general ideas." Lodge told Diem to phone him if he could do anything for his physical safety. That was the last conversation any American had with Diem. He fled the palace, but he and his brother were apprehended by the plotters, taken out in a truck, and executed. Earlier in 1963, Kennedy's Undersecretary of State, Alexis Johnson, was speaking before the Economic Club of Detroit. What is the attraction that Southeast Asia has exerted for centuries on the great powers flanking it on all sides? Why is it desirable and why is it important? First, it provides a lush climate, fertile soil, rich natural resources, a relatively sparse population in most areas, and room to expand. The countries of Southeast Asia produce rich exportable surpluses such as rice, rubber, teak, corn, tin, spices, oil, and many others. This is not the language that was used by President Kennedy in his explanations to the American public. He talked of communism and freedom. In a news conference, February 14, 1962, he said, "Yes, as you know, the U.S. for more than a decade has been assisting the government, the people of Vietnam, to maintain their independence." 3 weeks after the execution of Diem, Kennedy himself was assassinated, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, took office. The generals who succeeded Diem could not suppress the National Liberation Front. Again and again, American leaders expressed their bewilderment at the popularity of the NLF, at the high morale of its soldiers. The Pentagon historians wrote that when Eisenhower met with President-elect Kennedy in January 1961, he wondered aloud why in interventions of this kind we always seem to find that the morale of the communist forces was better than that of the democratic forces. And General Maxwell Taylor reported in late 1964, the ability of the Viet Cong continuously to rebuild their units and to make good their losses is one of the mysteries of the guerrilla war. Not only do the Viet Cong units have the recuperative powers of the Phoenix, but they have an amazing ability to maintain morale. Only in rare cases have we found evidences of bad morale among Viet Cong prisoners or recorded in captured Viet Cong documents. In early August 1964, President Johnson used a murky set of events in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam to launch full-scale war on Vietnam. Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told the American public there was an attack by North Vietnamese torpedo boats on American destroyers while on routine patrol in international waters, McNamara said. The U.S. destroyer Maddox underwent an unprovoked attack. It later turned out that the Gulf of Tonkin episode was a fake, that the highest American officials had lied to the public, just as they had in the invasion of Cuba under Kennedy. In fact, the CIA had engaged in a secret operation attacking North Vietnamese coastal installations, so if there had been an attack, it would not have been unprovoked. It was not a routine patrol, because the Maddox was on a special electronic spying mission. And it was not in international waters, but in Vietnamese territorial waters. It turned out that no torpedoes were fired at the Maddox, as McNamara said. Another reported attack on another destroyer 2 nights later, which Johnson called open aggression on the high seas, seems also to have been an invention. At the time of the incident, Secretary of State Rusk was questioned on NBC television. The reporter said, "What explanation, then, can you come up with for this unprovoked attack?" Rusk said, "Well, I haven't been able, quite frankly, to come to a full satisfactory explanation. There is a great gulf of understanding between that world and our world, ideological in character. They see what we think of as the real world in wholly different terms. Their very process of logic are different, so that it's very difficult to enter into each other's minds across the great ideological gulf." The Tonkin attack brought a congressional resolution passed unanimously in the House and with only 2 dissenting votes in the Senate, giving Johnson the power to take military action as he saw fit in Southeast Asia. 2 months before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, U.S. government leaders met in Honolulu and discussed such a resolution. Rusk said in this meeting, according to the Pentagon Papers, that public opinion on our Southeast Asia policy was badly divided in the United States at the moment, and that therefore the president needed an affirmation of support. The Tonkin resolution gave the president the power to initiate hostilities without the declaration of war by Congress that the Constitution required. The Supreme Court, supposed to be the watchdog of the Constitution, was asked by a number of petitioners in the course of the Vietnam War to declare the war unconstitutional. Again and again it refused even to consider the issue. Immediately after the Tonkin affair, American warplanes began bombarding North Vietnam. During 1965, over 200,000 American soldiers were sent to South Vietnam, and in 1966, 200,000 more. By early 1968, there were more than 500,000 American troops there, and the U.S. Air Force was dropping bombs at a rate unequaled in history. Tiny glimmerings of the massive human suffering under this bombardment came to the outside world. On June 5th, 1965, the New York Times carried a dispatch from Saigon. As the communists withdrew from Quang Ngai last Monday, United States jet bombers pounded the hills into which they were headed. Many Vietnamese, one estimate is as high as 500, were killed by the strikes. The American contention is that they were Viet Cong soldiers, but 3 out of 4 patients seeking treatment in a Vietnamese hospital afterward for burns from napalm or jellied gasoline were village women. On September 6th, another press dispatch from Saigon. In Bien Hoa province, south of Saigon, on August 15th, United States aircraft accidentally bombed a Buddhist pagoda and a Catholic church. It was the 3rd time their pagoda had been bombed in 1965. A temple of the Cao Dai religious sect in the same area had been bombed twice this year. In another Delta province, there is a woman who has both arms burned off by napalm and her eyelids so badly burned that she cannot close them. When it is time for her to sleep, her family puts a blanket over her head. The woman had 2 of her children killed in the airstrike that maimed her. The language of that is confusing. Few Americans appreciate what their nation is doing to South Vietnam with air power. Innocent civilians are dying every day in South Vietnam. Large areas of South Vietnam were declared free fire zones, which meant that all persons remaining within them, civilians, old people, children, were considered an enemy, and bombs were dropped at will. Villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong were subject to search and destroy missions. Men of military age in the villages were killed, the homes were burned, the women, children, and old people were sent off to refugee camps. Jonathan Schell, in his book The Village of Ben Suc, describes such an operation. A village surrounded, attacked, a man riding on a bicycle shot down. 3 people picnicking by the river shot to death. The houses destroyed, the women, children, old people herded together, taken away from their ancestral homes. The CIA in Vietnam, in a program called Operation Phoenix, secretly, without trial, executed at least 20,000 civilians in South Vietnam who were suspected of being members of the communist underground. 20,000 civilians. A pro-administration analyst wrote in the journal Foreign Affairs in January 1975, although the Phoenix program did undoubtedly kill or incarcerate many innocent civilians, it did also eliminate many members of the communist infrastructure. That's really heavy. Let's just kind of call it quits for there. I hope you enjoyed the reading. I hope you tune in to the next part of the chapter. Remember, if you like what you heard, hit the like, subscribe button and the notification bell. And we'll see you next time. Take it easy.